Alright, let's step into one of the most fascinating in-between moments in English literature, the Age of Transition. We're talking roughly 1740 to 1800, that long stretch between the polished classicism of Pope and the emotional fire of Wordsworth. So, what was happening in the background? Politically, the old party wars were cooling down. The Whigs dominated most of the mid-century, while the Tories only started to regain strength under George III. Meanwhile, Britain's empire was expanding. Trade, colonies, and new global connections were everywhere. Writers like Edmund Burke even wrestled with the moral and political challenges of empire in their work. And then, of course, came the French Revolution. Its cry for liberty, equality, and fraternity sent shockwaves through English thought and deeply influenced poets and novelists alike. Now, the literary scene itself was caught between two forces. On one side stood classicism, represented by Samuel Johnson, clear, balanced, moral, and traditional. On the other side emerged Romanticism, which had quietly begun with James Thomson's Seasons, and yes, that work has been asked in exam. This new romantic impulse wanted something very different. Writers began to turn back to nature, not as a decorative background, but as a living, emotional presence. Instead of the artificial shepherds and nymphs of the earlier pastoral, poets focused on real people, humble, poor, often struggling, and found beauty in their lives. Think of William Cowper and Robert Burns, both showing deep sympathy for ordinary men and women. The new poets also broke away from the heroic couplet, that tight Augustan rhythm, experimenting with freer, more natural verse. And their themes, loneliness, imagination, mystery, paved the way for later works like The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and La Belle Dame Sans Merci. Meanwhile, something called the New Learning was shaping taste. Scholars began rediscovering old ballads and medieval literature. Bishop Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry, another exam favorite, revived interest in the simplicity and emotion of early songs. Editors like Thomas Tyrwhitt and Edward Capell produced new editions of Chaucer and Shakespeare, celebrating the language's older, rougher beauty. Philosophically, this period was full of skepticism and inquiry. Writers questioned inherited systems and traditional religion. That intellectual unrest clearing away old dogmas helped make room for romantic imagination. At the same time, history itself became a literary subject. Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire turned historical writing into art, showing that prose could rival poetry in scope and grandeur. We also see the birth of realism, especially in the rise of the novel. Writers like Richardson, Fielding, and later Austen explored domestic life with an intimacy and freshness that echoed romantic emotion but stayed grounded in real experience. Finally, political writing started to fade. The age of pamphlets was ending, and independent men of letters like Samuel Johnson became the new voices of authority. They weren't tied to parties. They wrote for the reading public. So, in short, the Age of Transition is all about movement from the rule of reason to the stirrings of feeling, from heroic couplets to natural speech, from political pamphlets to the personal essay and the novel. It's the bridge that carries us from Johnson to Wordsworth, from logic to imagination. Alright, let's talk about one of the giants of 18th century English literature, Samuel Johnson. Born in Lichfield in 1709, Johnson was the son of a bookseller, and it's from his father that he inherited those strong Tory views he carried throughout his life. That birthplace and political leaning have both been asked in exam, so keep them in mind. Now, Johnson's early life wasn't easy. He suffered from a severe skin disease that left his face scarred and affected both his sight and his hearing. He was privately educated and later attended Oxford University, another exam favorite, but poverty haunted him there. He often couldn't afford basic comforts and eventually had to leave without a degree. After Oxford, Johnson tried his hand at school teaching, but that didn't go well either. He then married Elizabeth Porter, a widow 20 years older than him, a relationship that was affectionate but often misunderstood by others. In 1737, Johnson moved to London, heading straight for the struggling writer's world of Grub Street, and this part of his life is legendary. He faced hunger, debt, and humiliation, the sort of life later described vividly by Macaulay. Johnson himself hated to recall those days. They were painful reminders of how hard he had fought to survive. But slowly, through sheer persistence, he began to rise. His first real success came in 1738 with his poem London, a biting satire modelled after Juvenal. That success has been noted in exam. It gave him recognition, but not yet security. His great breakthrough came later with A Dictionary of the English Language, published between 1747 and 1755. This monumental work took nearly 9 years to complete and instantly made him famous. The dictionary itself has been directly asked in exam. With that, Johnson became the unquestioned literary leader of London. His achievements finally earned him financial stability. A state pension was granted to him in 1762, and for the rest of his life, he became a central figure in London's literary and social world. Now, you can't talk about Johnson without mentioning the club, also called the Literary Club, founded in February 1764. The details of its formation have been asked in exam many times. It was started by Johnson and the artist Joshua Reynolds as a dining club where the best minds of the day gathered. The 9 original members included Reynolds Johnson himself, Edmund Burke, Christopher Nugent, Topham Beauclerk, Bennet Langton, Oliver Goldsmith, Anthony Chenier, and John Hawkins. Imagine that dinner table, art, politics, philosophy, and gossip all in one evening. Johnson became famous not only for his writings, but also for his conversation, witty, booming, sometimes blunt, and always commanding. James Boswell, his devoted friend and biographer, captured this side of him in the life of Samuel Johnson, giving us the most vivid portrait of any writer in English history. Despite his gruff manners, people often described him as bearish. Johnson had deep kindness, humor, and moral strength. He could be superstitious and stubborn, but also deeply pious and compassionate. One of the lesser-known facts, which has been asked in exam, is that in 1771, Johnson and Alexander Pope both condemned the transport of 50,000 slaves into England, a remarkable moral stance for the time. He spent his later years surrounded by friends, conversation, and admiration. When he died in 1784, he left behind not just books, but an entire way of thinking about literature, disciplined, moral, and profoundly human. So, Samuel Johnson, the essayist, the lexicographer, the critic, and the conversationist, stands as the towering bridge between the age of prose and the coming romantic era. All right, let's explore the incredible range of Samuel Johnson's writings, the man who pretty much defined English prose in the 18th century. His career covers essays, poetry, biography, drama, and even a dictionary that changed the English language forever. Let's start with his essays, because that's really where his voice as a moralist and social critic comes alive. Johnson first wrote for the Birmingham Journal in 1732, but his big breakthrough came with his Plan for a Dictionary of the English Language in 1747. Yes, that title has been asked in exam. Soon after, between 1750 and 52, he produced The Rambler, a periodical full of reflective moral essays written in rich rhythmic prose. This is one of the most important essay series in English literature and absolutely an exam favorite. Then came The Adventurer from 1753 to 54, The Universal Visitor in 1756, and The Idler between 1758 and 60, another work you'll see in exam papers. Each of these journals captured Johnson's calm, balanced view of human life, wise, melancholy, and deeply humane. He also wrote a few shorter essays that stand out. For example, The Pernicious Effects of Reverie, which directly appears in exam questions. Later came his political and reflective pamphlets, The False Alarm, 1770, Thoughts on the Late Transactions Respecting Falklands Islands, 1771, The Patriot, 1774, A Journey to the Western Islands of Scotland, 1775, and Taxation No Tyranny, also 1775. all show his engagement with public life and politics. His collected reflections were later anthologized as The Beauties of Johnson in 1781. Now let's move to his poetry and drama. His first major piece was Messiah, written way back in 1728, a Latin translation of Alexander Pope's poem of the same name. And that's often asked in exam. Then came London in 1738, his imitation of Juvenal's satire full of social bite and energy. In 1747, he wrote a prologue at the opening of the theatre in Drury Lane, and in 1749, he produced his masterpiece poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes. This one's another Juvenalian imitation, but it's far more philosophical, a meditation on ambition, fate, and human limitation. And in the same year came his only tragedy, Irene, which was staged by his friend David Garrick. Both titles frequently appear in exam questions. Now, Johnson as a biographer and critic is just as fascinating. His early work, A Voyage to Abyssinia, 1735, was actually a translation from French, a travel narrative. Then came The Life of Mr. Richard Savage in 1744, which mixes biography and moral reflection, a key text for exam prep. In 1745, he wrote miscellaneous observations on the tragedy of Macbeth. And in 1756, he contributed Life of Brown to Thomas Brown's Christian Morals, another exam favorite. Around the same time, he proposed publishing the dramatic works of William Shakespeare by subscription and followed through with the plays of William Shakespeare and his famous preface to Shakespeare in 1765. That preface is one of the great critical essays in English literature, and it's often tested. His final monumental work in biography was Lives of the Poets, published between 1779 and 81, definitely one to mark with a star for exam revision. And of course, we can't forget Johnson's dictionary, a dictionary of the English language published in 1755. It's one of the landmarks of English learning. The preface to the dictionary, written the same year, is itself a work of literary art and philosophical reflection. Both the dictionary and its preface have been repeatedly asked in exam. Finally, his novel, or rather novella, The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, published in 1759. It's an allegorical tale exploring happiness, ambition, and the futility of worldly pursuit. And yes, that title is another frequent exam question. ADS. So to recap, The Rambler, The Idler, and the dictionary define Johnson the essayist. The Vanity of Human Wishes and Irene show him as poet and dramatist. Lives of the Poets and the preface to Shakespeare make him the greatest critic of his age. And Rasselas shows the philosopher behind it all. By the time he died, Samuel Johnson wasn't just a writer, he was an institution. His work summed up the wisdom, restraint, and moral seriousness of the entire 18th century. Let's quickly remember the major works of Samuel Johnson with this simple quote. His first works were Messiah in 1728 and London in 1738, which established him as a promising poet and moral voice. His second major work was The Life of Mr. Richard Savage in 1744, a touching and vivid biography of his eccentric friend. After that, remember the phrase, Savage wishes Irene. It connects Richard Savage to Johnson's only tragedy, Irene, performed in 1749. Next came The Rambler from 1750 to 1752 and The Idler from 1758 to 1760, two essay series filled with moral reflections and elegant prose that shaped his reputation as a great essayist. Then came A Dictionary of the English Language in 1755, Johnson's monumental achievement that took 9 years to complete and earned him national fame. After that, in 1759, he wrote The History of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia, a short philosophical tale exploring human happiness and ambition, famously written in just 1 week to pay for his mother's funeral expenses. His second last phase includes the plays of William Shakespeare in 1765, which featured his remarkable preface to Shakespeare, a landmark in English literary criticism. Finally, his last great work was Lives of the Poets, written between 1779 and 1781, a brilliant series of biographical and critical sketches of English poets. So the sequence is easy to remember: Messiah and London, Life of Richard Savage, Irene, The Rambler and the Idler, The Dictionary, Rasselas, Shakespeare, and finally Lives of the Poets. Alright, let's talk about Samuel Johnson, the poet. Most people remember him as a critic, essayist, and lexicographer. But yes, he also wrote poetry. The funny thing is, Johnson himself didn't think much of his verse, and critics agree he wrote little poetry, none of it truly first class. But two poems stand out: London and The Vanity of Human Wishes. Let's start with London, written in 1738. That's his very first major work, and it's been asked in exam again and again. Johnson had just moved to the city with his friend David Garrick in 1737, sharing a single room with barely enough money to survive. Out of that struggle came this poem, 263 lines written in heroic couplets, imitating Juvenal's third satire. In the poem, a character named Thais decides to leave London for Wales, disgusted by the corruption, vanity, and moral decay of city life. The tone is dark and bitter. You can feel Johnson's own frustration in it. When the poem was published anonymously in 1738, it got high praise from none other than Alexander Pope, who recognized Johnson's classical strength. That's an exam connection worth remembering. Johnson follows the Augustan tradition of imitating classical poets, especially Juvenal. Then comes his second great poem, The Vanity of Human Wishes, published in 1749. This one also imitates Juvenal, his 10th satire, but it's even more somber. Johnson examines all the things people chase in life: wealth, power, beauty, fame, and shows how every one of them ends in disappointment. It's gloomy, yes, but also full of conviction and moral depth. The heroic couplets here carry a kind of solemn grandeur. You can almost hear Johnson's voice steady, uncompromising, a bit world-weary. Together, London and The Vanity of Human Wishes express Johnson's signature pessimism, but also his moral strength. Now, here's something students love a little: London trivia. You'll see this title popping up all over English literature, so it's easy to mix them up in exams. London by Samuel Johnson, 1738. Satire on city life in heroic couplets after Juvenal. London by William Blake, 1794, a romantic protest poem criticizing oppression and industrial misery, very different in tone. London, 18, not 2, by William Wordsworth, opens with that famous line, Milton, "Thou shouldst be living at this hour." Wordsworth laments England's moral decay and calls on Milton's spirit to restore virtue. And just for the modern touch, London, a novel by Edward Rutherford, sweeps through 2000 years of the city's history through multiple families. So, the next time you see London in a question, make sure you know which one. Johnson's London belongs to the age of transition, still classical, still moral, still written in heroic couplets, but with that dark undertone that hints at the disillusionment of a changing age. Alright, let's talk about two of Samuel Johnson's finest works, one poetic, one biographical, that show both sides of his genius: The Vanity of Human Wishes and The Life of Mr. Richard Savage. Let's start with The Vanity of Human Wishes, published in 1748. Its full title, and this exact title has been asked in exam, is The Vanity of Human Wishes, the 10th satire of Juvenal imitated. The poem is Johnson's second imitation of the Roman satirist Juvenal, following his earlier poem London. Now, while London was political, taking sharp aim at corruption and government decay, The Vanity of Human Wishes is philosophical and moral. Instead of mocking human folly, Johnson approaches it with deep sympathy. Juvenal's original satire was fierce and scornful. Johnson's version, in contrast, is compassionate and profoundly Christian. He doesn't just laugh at human ambition, he mourns its futility. The poem's theme is timeless. All human efforts for wealth, power, beauty, fame end in disappointment. Johnson calls us to humility and faith, reminding us that wisdom lies in accepting divine will rather than chasing worldly success. Critically, it's often considered Johnson's greatest poem. Both Sir Walter Scott and T.S. Eliot admired it immensely, and the critic Howard D. Weinbrot even called it a great English poem. Despite that acclaim, it wasn't a financial success when it came out. Interestingly, Johnson had also changed publishers from Edward Cave, who printed London, to Robert Dodsley for this poem. So, London looks outward at society's problems. The vanity of human wishes looks inward at the human condition. Together, they show Johnson moving from satire to spiritual insight. Now, let's turn to The Life of Mr. Richard Savage, published 4 years earlier in 1744. The full title, which you should remember for exam, is An Account of the Life of Mr. Richard Savage, son of the Earl Rivers. This was Johnson's first major biographical work, and it established him as one of England's great life writers. He published it anonymously, but everyone soon knew it was his. The book tells the extraordinary, tragic story of Richard Savage, a poet who claimed to be the illegitimate son of a noble family, though that claim was never fully proved. What makes this biography special is that Johnson doesn't just recount events. He turns Savage's life into a moral study, a reflection on poverty, pride, and wasted talent. Johnson himself had known Savage personally and sympathized with his struggles. Through this portrait, he explored deeper ethical questions about genius, morality, and society's neglect of the poor. Later, Johnson included parts of this work in his monumental Lives of the Poets in 1779, but even on its own, The Life of Savage marks the birth of modern biography. It's lively, psychological, and deeply humane. So, if you are revising for exam, remember this contrast. The vanity of human wishes, moral, philosophical, rooted in Christian reflection. The Life of Richard Savage, realistic, biographical, exploring moral complexity through a real person's life. Alright, let's talk about Samuel Johnson's one and only play, Irene. Johnson actually wrote Irene much earlier, around 1726, but he brought the manuscript to London in 1737, hoping to make his name in drama. David Garrick, his old friend from school, finally staged it in 1749 at Drury Lane Theatre, and yes, that's been asked in exam. Unfortunately, Irene ran for only 9 nights and failed to impress audiences. Critics found it too stiff, too serious, and lacking the spark of real drama. Still, it remains an important milestone, Johnson's only dramatic work, showing his early ambition before he turned to essays and moral prose. So, while Irene didn't shine on stage, it opened the curtain on Johnson's long and remarkable literary career.